I would like to thank everybody for being here. And tonight, we are going to start talking about listening skills. We will break this up into two parts. Quick reminder for my background for those that haven't tuned in before. I completed my master's in divinity in 2016. I was the executive director of Illinois Firefighter Peer Support. I've also created a lot of curriculum for teaching in many different aspects. 30 plus years in the fire service, currently working as a captain for the Evanston Fire Department. We're going to start out with this quick video because this is like one of my favorite videos. So I hope you enjoy it as well.
It's just there's all this pressure, you know. And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Have a nail head.
It's not about
Are you sure? Because I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there.
stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
On. If you would just
Don't.
try to say
Things
So I really enjoy that video because I think it really, uh, whoop, it really just kind of exemplifies a lot of what we're going to be talking about when it comes to listening. So quick overview, we're going to talk a little bit about how to be truly present, things to do, things not to do, understanding sympathy versus empathy versus over identifying. That chunk there will probably be on part two, and then some things to say when appropriate. So why does good listening matter? I've mentioned Michael Nichols in the past, and these are two of my favorite quotes. To be heard is to be made whole. And really, when I hear that, it reminds me. I always explain that, like, if you've ever had that time where you had something really amazing happen, and you were really anxious to share it, and you start sharing it, and the person you're talking to suddenly kind of hijacks that conversation, you really feel empty inside, as opposed to someone that was actively listening and you felt heard. You can feel that in your heart. Like it feels good. And that's really what the crux of this is, right? And then the second quote is, few motives in human experience are as powerful as the yearning to be understood. Being listened to means we are taken seriously. And again, that's just within our human DNA to be understood, taken seriously. Ultimately, it's human connection. And that's what listening creates, is that connection. So what are some of the primary objectives? Uh, Real quick, before we go into primary objectives, I don't have a slide for this, but this is important to state. Listening is a skill. Some people, and I'm sure we all know this, there's some people that are just naturally good listeners. And you can tell who they are because every time someone has a problem, that's probably, you're like, oh man, so-and-so's, someone's talking to him again, someone's talking to her again. It's always that person. They have that skill. Now, the fortunate thing is it's a skill that we can develop. Hopefully, as we go through this, you'll see where your good points are, and maybe you'll see some points where I could do better. Ultimately, listening becomes it's a skill that we can get better at through practice. And one of the things I'll encourage you when we finish up tonight, over the next month till we come back again and do part two, is to try and actively think about how you're listening. And again, a, a listening exercise is different than having like a simple conversation, right? Conversation is really, it's a back and forth. And while when we talk about peer support, it's a little bit of a back and forth. The main goal is helping the peer looking for help. We want them to feel heard. Just like we did on the last slide here, we want them to feel understood and taken seriously, right? That's the goal of our listening skills. So, primary objectives, showing up, right? Like you might think, well, of course, showing up. But oftentimes it's actually a little more involved than just, hey, I'll be there. And we'll talk about that in the next couple slides. So we want to be able to show up. We want to actually be there, not just physically, but mentally, right? Listening, letting the person talk. And then we've talked about this before. I'm pretty sure that listen, relate, validate piece. One of the things, again, I'll remind you that we oftentimes hesitate to ask if someone is looking for assistance or you can see someone struggling. We will oftentimes hesitate to ask if we can help because we feel like we're going to have to fix it. That's not the case. What we need to do, especially in the peer support realm, is very simple: listen, relate, and validate. So, again, a reminder there is what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about listening and then relate. So, the relate piece, the perfect example, easy example for me is really any other first responder can come to me, and I always say I haven't seen it all, but nothing surprises me. So there's nothing another first responder could tell me that would surprise me or shock me or kind of push back, right? Like you come up with the craziest story you can imagine, and I'd be like, well, of course that's what happened, right? Why wouldn't it? And so, each of us have these different areas that we really have that that market, if you will, that we can connect with. And so it's listen, the people you can relate with, and then validate what they're telling you, validate their experience, validate their feelings. And so it's not a matter of fixing, it's a matter of, again, making them feel understood and accepted. And then finally, only when appropriate, comfort, encouragement, possible instruction, or advice, right? But we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially in the second week. But the advise thing is has to be handled in a very careful way. So things to think about. Be aware of what you're bringing into the room. Personal baggage. This is really huge. So personal baggage can be something as simple. I kind of mentioned to you before we started. I had a long couple shifts, so sometimes my thought processes get jumbled up, or I'll have a pause. Right, it's the thoughts don't always come straight to my brain like I typically feel after a good night's sleep. Be aware if you're meeting with someone, are you setting that up? I would try to set up a meeting on a day where I was off the previous day for me, right? So if you work a 12-hour shift and you work 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., maybe meeting someone at 7 p.m. isn't the best time because mentally you might be a little checked out, right? So you want to be aware of what you're bringing into that room. Also, remember that your life experiences come with you, your worldviews, right? So, maybe if someone was, I mean, and again, a very simple one, if someone was from a different faith background, it might be difficult for me to understand. Not that I can't understand them as a person, but to understand some of their struggles might be difficult because I don't have that same worldview. Um, and it doesn't mean that you can't help someone with a different worldview. You just need to be aware, right? You have to put your own thoughts and feelings in that respect kind of on the back burner, bracket them out, and just focus on the person you're talking with. And then we have don't commit to a meeting if you don't have time. Again, a lot of your listening skills, it's more body language than anything else, and inflection. If you don't have time for a meeting and it's rushed, it will feel rushed, and the person you're talking with won't really feel that invitation to be open. So be sure you have time to do this. Set a time limit. I like to set an hour time limit when I'm meeting with someone, and let them know up front. And this does a couple things. First of all, I'm sure we all know that one person that can probably talk for, well, forever, right? And never get to a point. And that's okay. That's a lot of times, that's I got a couple guys I work with, right? Their brains are just going, 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 and it's 5 conversations in 10 minutes. And that's fine. When you set a time limit, that lets the person you're going to be connecting with know, hey, this is what's really important to me. I want to be sure I get this out. It helps them focus. And also, it's just the simple reality that even an hour can be pretty long if you're doing a one-on-one peer. By the time you reach the end of the hour, mentally, if you're actively listening and working at it, you can be a little like mentally spent as well. And so that hour is a good limit. And it doesn't mean that you set a timer and your buzzer doesn't need to go off, but you let them know up front. And then, if you're kind of in some stuff and you hit your hour, hey, you know what, I got another 15 minutes or so, but we'll wrap up and we'll do this again. So be sure to set that time limit because it really helps both you and the speaker. So where are you going to meet? Is it private? Does it need to be? There can be some simple things that, hey, I'm just, I haven't been sleeping well or whatever that can maybe just be talk at a desk in an office or whatever. You might have a coworker that's struggling with a boss and doesn't want to talk there, right? So maybe it's in a coffee shop somewhere outside of work. Another option, if it needs to be private, one of my favorite recommendations is a library. Most libraries have private rooms, and it's actually libraries are really great because not only do they have private rooms that sometimes you have to reserve them, most of the time they're open, but almost always the library rooms have glass windows in them, so it's all open, which is, again, just from my pastoral background, exposure, openness, and visibility is always a good thing. Remember, if you're meeting with someone that's struggling, they may be in a very vulnerable place. So you want to be careful to protect both you and the person you're listening to. Sit in a comfortable place, eye level. I love this picture. Another picture I used to have was I had Obama behind his desk, and kind of the point was like, maybe you're a manager at work and you got this big old desk. I always laugh. Not that I've ever had to go to, well, all right. So I've been in the chief's office a couple times, but he's behind this big desk and he's got almost like this big throne back there, and it's in front of his desk looks like a folding chair. So you sit down and you're somewhere down here and he's up here. Well, that body language says a lot. So try to sit in a comfortable place, eye level. If you have a table that's comfortable, if there's one chair that's nicer, let the person you're meeting with give them the comfortable chair. It gives them the advantage. Remember, they're probably feeling a little vulnerable and maybe a little they've got some stuff going on. If you can give them that one little piece, I actually, this is a great example. It was last year. As an officer, I'm on either a ladder truck or an engine, and I got anywhere from 2 to 4 other crew members. And one of my crew members had to go over to our resource hospital to review a call. So we get in this office. It's a big U-shaped table. She sits on the far side. The 2 members from our EMS coordinators, they're on the other side. And then we have a division chief comes in, she sits on the other side, and I'm just kind of like last one in the room. And I almost just kind of sat down. I'm like, whoa, time out. Like this poor girl had 4 people with white shirts in charge, like facing her. And I'm like, wow, this isn't an inquisition, right? So I made my move around around the table, and I sat like not like right on her, but like one chair away. So both her and I were facing everybody. And I never said anything about it. And someone told me later she had told them how thankful she was. She said it was so intimidating. And Tom came around and sat on my side of the table, right? So that this body language and how we sit actually sends an awful lot of information. And if we want people to be open and we want to give them opportunity to be heard, we we have to create that inviting atmosphere. Don't sit too far away. Don't invade their personal space. I always remind people that if you're talking with someone and you're kind of up close and they back up, I remind people that's not an invitation to move in closer. Some people don't really understand that personal space thing, right? Be cognizant of that. Sit where you're comfortable. If let them sit and then sit down. They'll either be relaxed or they may get a little uptight, right? But if they're uptight, they're gonna move away, right? If it's an issue where like you're in a coffee shop and you struggle to hear because they're far away, just let them know, hey, I'm just gonna scoot in a little bit. I just want to be able to hear you. But again, just it's really important that we honor their personal space. Listen with an open mind. This can be really hard. I mentioned earlier, I gave the example of different faith backgrounds. Sometimes you can be meeting with someone that's just completely different. I met with a gentleman that on a personal level, I was not, how do I say this? I don't know how to say this nicely. I was not a fan. I did not share his moral values. I felt that he really struggled in some moral areas. Let's just put it that way. And then he reached out and wanted to meet. And so, now here I am. I'm the person that offers peer support, and I'm like, you know, honestly went to that meeting. I had to sit in my car before I went in. We met for breakfast, took a deep breath, and had to remind myself, leave my judgments. However you do that, and you can set them aside. Like I'm gonna go in, and I'm gonna go in there from a position of not knowing. Like I never met this guy. I just want to hear his story. And I got to tell you, to this day, that was probably one of my, it was a real, it really affected me because after I heard his story, and not that I would make excuses for people's behavior, but suddenly hearing his story, I could maybe understand some of the poor moral judgments that I felt he made, right? But again, had I gone in there without leaving my assumptions out and leaving that judgment outside, I would have had a brick wall between me and him. And it was really an amazing time to listen and understand his story. And then even be able to offer some thoughts on how he could make moves forward. Because even he was the crux of it was he was recognizing that he had some moral deficiencies. And this was a chance for him to step out and admit that and move forward. So uh, when I have on there, listen with curiosity, I really can't push that enough that, as you practice this over, take time to practice it after over the next month before we meet again. But really, when you're listening to someone, stop and just be that 5-year-old kid that has never seen this thing before and wants to know and understand it. Really listen to someone with curiosity to know who they are and what makes them tick. And that willingness to learn. Again, super important. If one of the issues we can have when it comes to listening and especially peer support, someone's reached out for help. So that can immediately make us feel like we're in a position of authority because we're helping someone else. They came to us for help. It can look like I'm the authority. If we again suspend that judgment and just go, man, I don't know anything. I want this guy to tell me everything. It's that curiosity and a willingness to learn about them without judgment that can really make help us make a good connection and really help someone feel listened to. All right, things not to do. Again, some of these might seem pretty like, well, of course. At the same time, I've watched people do this. Drumming and tapping fingers, if you're sitting there playing the drums on a table, you're not listening, right? Playing with a ring or a pencil. I put those two specifically because I know I tend to fiddle with my ring a lot. Uh, a lot of nervous energy. I'm always moving, right? You might have noticed as you're watching. But yeah, but pay attention to those things. The pencil, I remember I was doing my clinical rotations at a local hospital, and there was this nurse, and we would do the shift changes, and he would give his report. And I don't know how anybody ever heard anything. That man could twirl a pen. I can't, I'm not even gonna try because I'll probably hurt myself, but he could spin a pen in his fingers like it was a baton. And he'd just be looking at his notes, talking away, just spinning, spinning, spinning. And all I saw was a pen spinning, never heard anything. Fortunately, uh, I was just there mostly as an observer, so I didn't need to hear it all. But again, pay attention to those little ticks, if you will. We all have them. So pay attention to those a little bit. Yawning, again, I get it. Sometimes we do all yawn. Uh, Try to hide it if you can, restrain, because it just sends a message. Repeated glances, clock, watch, door. I know when I'm meeting someone at a coffee shop, especially in the summer, I'll always sit with my back to the windows and glass. I don't want to I don't want to be distracted by people coming and going. If I hear a Harley Davidson driving down the road, I can't not look. Like I gotta see what it looks like. Is it nicer than mine? Of course it isn't. But I gotta look to see, right? So again, you pay attention to the distractions, and then of course, not looking at the person, always looking down. Make eye contact, make comfortable eye contact. I always remind you though, it's not a staring contest. It's comfortable. Look at their eyes. You can look down a little bit, look at their eyes, and maintain. But also, it allows you want to see their facial expressions as well because there's no guideline to what it tells you, but if you know somebody, we know more by those micro expressions tell our brains a lot of information and really trust those intuitions when you're meeting with someone. Cell phones. This is really a big deal to me. Like when I'm teaching my class, I tell people like I don't even want to know about don't not silence, turn it off. Just turn it off. If you want to end a good meeting, a good session of listening to someone, have a phone go off. And I know, oh, it's on vibrate. But we all know what's the first thing that happens when it vibrates? You're if it's on the table, you both hear it. So your brain goes, could be the end of the world. I gotta look, I don't know. Maybe my house just blew up or what, whatever. And of course, it's some kind of junk text message for who knows what, right? Home Depot's got a sale. Again, it's a huge distraction. So I always tell people, take your phone. And if I forget, like I'll pull my phone out in the beginning of it. Oh man, I'm so sorry. Look, I'm just gonna turn this off real quick. Let them know it's off, right? And then don't leave it on the table. Put it in your pocket, put it under your leg. Don't leave it on the table because again, when this sits between you and the listener, this becomes a barrier. It's a distraction. And I do give you the exception if you have kids and you need to leave it on, then you just let that person know, hey, my kid's been sick. I'm really sorry. I need to leave this on just in case. But again, explain that. Now, you put it away, but you do bring it in, and this is why you bring it in, because the one time that I'll tell you to take your phone out is when you're done with the conversation, and then you take the phone out and you turn it on. You go, hey, I'm gonna look at my calendar. What day are you open next week? And we'll talk more about that or maybe we did talk about that in peer support in the first one. But you take your phone out, you open your calendar, and you set a date. Always set a date because we know that when we have these conversations, The typical ending is, hey, you know what, let's catch up next week. And oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, then a month later, you bump into each other and you're like, oh, hey, we got to get together. Yeah, we do. And it just keeps getting pushed off. Set the date. If they don't need to connect with you again, maybe they'll cancel. Or maybe you'll just hang out and have some good coffee and a conversation, right? But set a date and a time for that second meeting. That's the one time to take out your phone while you're meeting with someone. So what are some common mistakes? Comparing. They tell you something that's going on, and you're like, oh yeah, I've had that happen to me too, right? And so suddenly they feel diminished. So you want to be careful about comparing. Now, this is a kind of a fine line here. You want to remember that there's that listen, relate, validate, and that relate piece if we've had a similar experience. So we can, sometimes that's helpful to build that connection, but you don't want to overshadow what they're experiencing. They tell you that they had a bad day and they had a flat tire, and you're like, oh yeah, I've had some bad days. Man, my motor blew out and I got to replace my car. Well, wow. Well, I'm kind of stupid because complaining about my tire, right? So, but again, if you can say, oh yeah, man, car troubles are the worst. It's very difficult, right? And so yeah, it is, right? So again, you want to be careful about not overshadowing what they're going through. Second guessing. Are you sure? Are you sure XYZ is really the problem on this? And you'll trust me, you do this enough, you'll hear people talking and they'll be complaining about XYZ, and you're like, I've listened to this story and I think probably what you're dealing with is ABC over there. Don't second guess. That's what they're feeling in the moment. You can ask them more questions, and we'll talk about that later as well. But by asking more in-depth questions, you can help them flush that out. But if you tell someone that it's somewhere else, you're done. They'll stop talking. And then discounting, very similar to comparing. That's nothing. This one time this happened to me. So that again kind of cancels out what they were worried about. Filtering. Filtering is, uh, remember we talked about be aware what you bring into the room. So filtering could be something like, I show up to have breakfast with this guy, but man, I just worked a 48, got 2 hours of sleep last night. I'm exhausted. And now he starts sharing something with me, but I don't have the mental capacity to go with this. So I just kind of filter it out, and because I'm trying to take care of myself in this moment. And so now you don't ask the good clarifying questions that you would normally ask. Judging. I think you should, right? You don't know what they think they should do, and you should really never tell, I think you should do this. They may ask you, man, what do you think I should do? Wow, that's a great question. What do you think you should do? Again, the key to this, when we talked about that in that first, I think the first night when we talked directly about peer support, is from my experience, most people, when they start talking to you, when they're struggling with something, they oftentimes know the answers. They just, for whatever reason, they just can't bring it out. They can't face it. They don't have the energy, or maybe they just feel alone in this, so they don't have that uh, that drive to do it. But getting connected with someone can help them share that load. Mind reading. Mind reading is you have a person that's sharing their story with you, and maybe you have a similar experience, but your experience was, you know, I had this happen and this was the result. So now you start thinking, well, that's the result. So that's what's going on here. And you don't know. You're pushing your thoughts into their story. And of course, this is probably one of the most common ones, rehearsing your next line. As soon as they say something and you start thinking about like, oh, I want to ask them XYZ, this, you're thinking about what you're going to say and not what they're saying. And you've totally lost the conversation. Detouring would be shifting topics because you're unsure or uncomfortable. Again, when we talked about being aware of what you bring in the room, maybe you've had a traumatic experience in your past. And let's just say that you're meeting with someone. I'll just because it's what I know. If I meet with another first responder that's maybe had something that dealt with an infant death, but maybe I didn't know that, right? And then I start talking, and they start bringing this up, and well, I had one of those a couple months ago, and I'm not over it. So now I detour the topic over to something different because it makes me unsure or uncomfortable. And again, almost like when we talked about the avoidance stuff, I'm pretty sure we talked about avoidance and how that's kind of sneaky because we don't realize when we're doing avoidance because of trauma, because our subconscious makes us do that. Detouring will do that. We'll be uncomfortable with a certain area of a conversation, so we'll shift to something we're more comfortable with. This one's pretty obvious. Arguing, don't argue with someone. If they're dead wrong, then they're dead wrong. But that's not your place as a listener to argue with someone. Placating. Placating is when someone may suggest that they're struggling with something, but you're maybe struggling with the same thing and don't want to admit that. So you're like, oh no, that's not too big of a deal. I watched one of our guys a few years back. I was like, oh boy, he said something. He had a kind of a newer baby at home, and he made a comment about his wife was complaining about how much beer he was having after dinner. And I forget he says, oh, I don't know, I just had like four. And of course, for full disclosure, I don't really drink, maybe one or two a year, if that. Uh, but of course, I'm like, well, four after dinner, I'd be passed out. Uh, But then the rest of the table's all like, yeah, that's no big deal. That's placating because everybody sitting at that table was like, well, that could be me. And I don't want to admit I have a problem, so he doesn't have a problem, right? So you have to watch out for placating because that's really a self-preservation technique, if you will. So again, these are all common mistakes that we need to think about when we're having these conversations. I would recommend over the next month till we meet again for part two, take some time and pay attention, even at work or even with your significant other, your spouses, your kids. Like, wow, am I really listening to this person or is this just kind of a conversation? And then find ways where you can work in those little niches of that, even if it's not like it's supposed to be a listening session, like practice some of those skills and pay attention to some of the nuances of what you're doing that maybe you could cut out. A lot of what I talk about in listening comes from The Lost Art of Listening, from Michael Nichols and Martha Strauss. That book is good. It's thick and maybe a little dry. However, Patrick King, How to Listen with Intention, if you go to wherever you buy your books, Amazon, and just search Patrick King books, you'll see he's got a whole bunch on listening. I would probably recommend this one. I have two of his books. What I learned pretty quick was it's a lot of the same information, just in a different way. But that book was actually really good. So those are kind of my two recommendations if you're looking to read a little further. In part two, we'll talk about reflective listening, reflective responses, and we'll talk a little bit more about worldview things, as well as what's the how to not like overshare and over empathize, sympathy, empathy, and taking on someone's struggles. So that's what we'll be doing next week. With that, I thank you for being here.